Before we start, take a moment to like and subscribe. The world knows John Lennon as the ultimate prophet of peace and love, a man who told us to imagine a world without strife. But the real story is a discordant melody, a brutal and often ugly tale of a man wrestling with his own demons. This is the story of the angry, flawed man behind the round glasses, a rock and roll rebel who often broke the very rules he set for others. From the very beginning, a rebellious streak defined him. He was the sardonic wit of the Beatles, the one with the razor-sharp tongue who could demolish an interviewer with a single sneering comment. This savage wit was often applauded, but in private, it was a weapon. The first dark note in his life was his deeply traumatic and emotionally turbulent childhood. Abandoned by his father and later given up by his mother Julia, to be raised by his strict Aunt Mimi, the young Lennon was a child of profound emotional neglect. Aunt Mimi, a woman of firm values, demanded a level of academic discipline and emotional restraint that felt alien to his artistic spirit. This created a deep, simmering resentment that fueled his rebellion and contributed to his later struggles with authority. This anger manifested in his treatment of those closest to him. He openly confessed in later interviews to being physically and emotionally cruel. "I used to be cruel to my woman, and physically any woman. Any man who says he's never hit a woman is lying," he said in a startling moment of self-revelation. His inner turmoil was a raw, dangerous force, a temper he never learned to control and a behavior he learned to excuse as an unfortunate byproduct of his artistic genius. As Beatlemania exploded, so did his famous arrogance. The first major public news came in 1966 with his now infamous "more popular than Jesus" comment. It was a moment of stunning hubris that nearly destroyed the band's career in America. The statement, initially buried in a London newspaper interview, was not meant as a boast. His full quote explained that Christianity was on the wane in Europe and that he saw the Beatles as simply a more relevant cultural force at the time. This context, however, was lost in translation when it reached the American South. Fundamentalist Christians organized rallies to publicly burn Beatles albums and merchandise, and radio stations across the country boycotted their music. This incident laid bare Lennon's growing sense of invincibility and his disregard for the consequences of his words. But this same hubris was a private hell for his family. While he was preaching universal love to millions, his hidden marriage to Cynthia Lennon was being torn apart by his constant infidelity and psychological abuse. He forbade Cynthia from revealing their marriage to the public, forcing her to live a shadow life while he lived in the rock and roll spotlight. He would berate and ridicule her, a pattern of emotional abuse that made her existence a living hell. She was a ghost in her own marriage, forced to watch her husband become the biggest star in the world, while she remained a hidden secret. On one notorious occasion, he struck Cynthia after she danced with Paul McCartney at a party. A shocking act of jealous rage that revealed the frightening depth of his temper. His treatment of his own son was perhaps the most heartbreaking contradiction of all. While the world celebrated him, he made Julian feel like an unwanted outsider, often ignoring him and in later years, publicly belittling him. He famously mocked Julian's artwork, a childish drawing, in front of the press. He refused to be an attentive father, often leaving Julian to be raised by Cynthia and later, to a large extent, by Paul McCartney, who famously wrote "Hey Jude" to comfort the young boy during his parents' separation. Julian's loneliness and pain were a direct consequence of his father's neglect, a tragic shadow that followed the boy into adulthood. He would often call Julian only when he was drunk, and he was known to make cruel comments to his son on the phone. A twisted form of contact that spoke to his inability to express real remorse or love. The unexpected turn came in the form of Yoko Ono. She was not just the woman who broke up the Beatles. She was the catalyst for his most profound personal and artistic change, both for better and for worse. His obsession with her led to a full-blown abandonment of his family. Lennon himself was a child who was abandoned by his father. And in a crushing act of irony, he repeated the very cycle of abandonment he hated. Their life together was an experiment in public performance art, with events like the famous Bedin for Peace in Montreal. But the internal struggle for the band was just as real as the external hatred directed at Yoko. Her presence in the studio during recording sessions was an unprecedented breach of the Beatles' creative sanctuary. And Lennon's push for the avant-garde Revolution 9 on the White Album was a shocking departure that further alienated the group. Behind the scenes, the couple was a lightning rod for public hatred. Yoko was blamed for breaking up the Beatles, and the intense public scorn fueled Lennon's paranoia and isolation. The Lost Weekend, a 1970s period where he separated from Yoko and spiraled into a drug and alcohol-fueled haze. It was a time of utter chaos and public humiliation. It was a 15-month-long public spectacle where the man who preached inner serenity was consumed by a self-destructive frenzy. He was belligerent, drunken, and out of control, a far cry from the serene guru the world had imagined him to be. His erratic behavior became a staple of tabloids. A particularly infamous night saw him drunkenly heckle and get thrown out of the Troubadour Club in Los Angeles, where he tried to put a cigarette out on a waitress's head and wore a sanitary napkin on his own. He also engaged in a vicious public feud with Paul McCartney during this time, trading insults in the press and even releasing a song, "How Do You Sleep?" That was a direct and scathing attack on his former bandmate. The lyrics were a brutal and personal assault, a far cry from the ideals of brotherhood he sang about just a few years earlier. After so many years of darkness and despair, the final chapter of his life suddenly felt like a brilliant spark of hope. After reconciling with Yoko, he retreated from the public eye for 5 years to raise their son, Sean. This period, known as his house husband years, showed a different side of him, a man who was trying, for the first time, to be a present and loving father. He embraced a meticulous domesticity, obsessively baking bread and managing household affairs, a stark contrast to his previous rock star chaos. This retreat from the limelight was a conscious effort to heal and rediscover a sense of normalcy, a life that was both mundane and restorative. But even this was a bittersweet victory. While he was making amends, the emotional distance between him and Julian remained, a chasm that could not be easily bridged. Despite Julian's attempts to reconnect, Lennon's emotional walls and the lingering pain of the past kept them apart. His final public photo, a hauntingly iconic shot of him with a seemingly peaceful expression, was a stark contrast to the turbulent life he had lived. It captured a man who had found a fragile peace, but was still haunted by unresolved personal conflict. In his last years, he found a deep sense of peace, but those emotional wounds still lingered, a complex end for a complicated man. Ultimately, the true story of John Lennon is not a fairy tale of transformation, but a brutal and honest look at a man who is deeply, beautifully, and tragically flawed. His legacy is not a simple anthem, but a haunting, complicated melody of a man who was a prophet to the world, but a contradiction to himself. The man who told us to imagine a world of peace and love was himself in a constant, brutal war with his own demons.